The clay and iron crown of Thornmere was far heavier than it looked, pressing a dull, relentless ache into the base of her skull. The grand solar hall was a cavernous expanse of black granite, its vaulted ceilings lost in the shadows, while freezing winter drafts swept across the polished floor. It was meant to be the glorious dawn of her reign as queen. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. The collective, sneering weight of the Lycan nobility pressed down upon her, but she kept her head bowed just a fraction, a necessary concession to the sheer volume of predatory eyes fixed upon her from every corner of the vast room. The high-born ladies of the court stood clustered in their exquisite silk gowns of crimson and silver. Their collective presence created a stifling cloud of gardenia perfume and heavy ambergris that entirely failed to mask the sharp, feral musk of their wolf natures. Seren stood at the center of the dais, wrapped in a simple pale linen gown that had been hastily tailored to fit her frame. The stiff leather of her unfamiliar royal shoes pinched her heels with every slight shift in weight. It was a constant, grounding reminder of how deeply she did not belong in this kingdom of ice and teeth. She was a common-born healer, a woman who had spent her life grinding bitter roots and unbinding broken bones in the muddy outer villages. At her side stood Kalin Ironwood. He was a mountain of a man, his massive, intimidating physical frame wrapped in ceremonial furs. His storm-grey eyes projected an absolute, unfeeling authority to the rest of the world. But to her, he was an anchor. The crescent-claiming mark, hidden beneath the collar of her dress, throbbed with a steady, searing heat. It was perfectly synchronized with the heavy, suppressed rhythm of his heartbeat. The crowd parted with deliberate, synchronized movement as a tall, silver-haired nobleman approached the dais. Aldous Vane moved with the terrifying, fluid elegance of an apex predator who had never once known the sting of hunger. His velvet doublet was immaculate, devoid of a single stray thread, and his smile was a practiced hollow curve that did not reach his pale eyes. Next to him walked his daughter, Lady Beatrice, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and unforgiving as a freshly honed blade. The rival had long been the court's favoured choice for the king's mate, and her resentment radiated into the cold air like physical heat. "To our new Luna," Duke Vane announced, raising a goblet of honeyed wine. His voice echoed off the granite pillars, smooth and carrying the dangerous undertone of an approaching avalanche. May her unique background bring a deeply needed, simple perspective to the High Court of Thornmere. A ripple of stifled, mocking laughter swept through the assembled nobility. The clinking of silver goblets sounded like the sharpening of knives. Seren felt a distinct flare of heat radiate from the massive warrior standing next to her. Kalin's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck chording instantly as a low animalistic rumble began to vibrate in the depths of his chest. The mate bond flared, turning the mark on her collarbone from a comforting warmth into a blistering brand of territorial fury. Before the Alpha could unleash his wrath upon his own court, Seren reached out. She did not look at him. She simply let her small, coal-used fingers brush against his heavy, scarred knuckles, applying a quiet, downward pressure. The fierce, molten heat of his anger met the absolute, unyielding calm of her touch, and he forced himself to swallow the growl. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her smile dripping with sweet, practiced venom. She extended a silver platter bearing a delicate embroidered silk handkerchief. "A small token for your transition to palace life, my queen," the young woman murmured, her voice carrying just loudly enough for the front rows of the aristocracy to hear. "To protect the royal silks. It must be so terribly difficult, maneuvering through such fine fabrics with hands so dreadfully scarred." Seren looked down at her own hands. The pads of her fingers were thick with calluses, the skin stained with the faint, permanent yellowish hue of moonflower root and dried yarrow. They were the hands of a woman who worked, who survived, who healed. She did not pull them away. She did not hide them in the folds of her skirt. The stinging humiliation burned in her throat, but she forced the emotion down into the dark, quiet well inside her mind. She recalled the long, grueling years spent mastering her craft in the muddy outer villages, learning from her elders how to weather the cruelest storms by simply bending like a reed in the wind. Patience was her armor. She had been taught to endure the snapping jaws of the world by remaining perfectly still and entirely unassuming. The court thought her small. They thought her weak. They possessed absolutely no comprehension of the ancient cosmic bloodline sleeping silently beneath her skin. Seren subtly traced her left wrist, her thumb resting over the faint invisible scar that bound her true heritage. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. The elders of the extinct Sunborn covenant had placed it there when she was a child. They had locked away the blinding golden fire of her ancestors to keep her hidden from the very beasts who now mocked her. She swallowed the insult, accepting the handkerchief with a slow, dignified nod. She would let them believe she was nothing but a fragile weed. A weed could not be blamed when it quietly overtook a garden. The vast audience chamber transformed into a massive banquet of sensory excess, though the atmosphere remained as brittle as thin ice over a rushing river. The sheer scale of the Lycan aristocracy's wealth was staggering. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted pheasant, heavy winter root vegetables dripping in butter, and massive silver bowls of dark, spiced wine. The clatter of cutlery and the low, rumbling hum of aristocratic conversation echoed off the high, dark ceiling, creating a wall of sound that felt almost oppressive. Tapestries depicting ancient wolf hunts fluttered against the cold stone walls, stirred by the relentless winter drafts that managed to penetrate the fortress. Yet, the overwhelming smell of the rich, heavy food was turning her stomach. A subtle, persistent nausea had been plaguing her for 3 days. It was a quiet secret she guarded fiercely, a truth she had not yet whispered even to the Alpha King. Beneath the thick linen of her dress, deep within her lower abdomen, a faint fluttering warmth had begun to take root. It was a tiny spark of life, a perfect fusion of Kalin's immense, terrifyingly protective Lycan strength and her own dormant, ancient Sunborn fire. The maternal instinct within her was already ferocious, sharp and unyielding, demanding she protect the child at all costs. Every time she breathed in the heavy gardenia perfume of the noble women or the metallic tang of the silver goblets, her stomach rolled in violent protest. The rich meats and heavily spiced wines offered by the servants made her throat tight with revulsion. She forced herself to sip only clear water, keeping her posture perfectly straight, her eyes carefully tracking the movements of the court from beneath her dark lashes. Kalin sat next to her at the high table, radiating a rigid, protective hostility that kept the nearest nobles at a careful distance. He carved his meat with brutal, mechanical efficiency, his piercing metallic gaze constantly scanning the shadows of the vaulted hall. He could feel her discomfort through the mate bond. The crescent mark on her collarbone pulsed with his silent, questioning concern. Seren offered him a small, reassuring smile, sending a wave of calm, honeyed warmth back across their connection to soothe his anxious beast. She was an expert at enduring the cold, and she would endure this frozen court for him. Across the hall, Duke Vane sat at the head of the high-born faction's table. He did not eat. He merely watched Seren with an unblinking reptilian patience. His pale eyes flicked down to her untouched plate, then up to the glass of water she held with 2 hands, and finally to the slight, almost imperceptible way she leaned away from the heavily perfumed ladies sitting nearby. A slow, terrifying realization crept into Seren's mind as she caught the subtle, calculating shift in his posture. He was observing her aversions. He was cataloguing her physical weakness, looking for the exact angle to strike. The Duke leaned over, whispering something into the ear of Lady Beatrice, who smiled behind her jeweled wine cup. It was a cold, satisfied smile. A sudden, instinctual chill swept over Seren's skin, entirely unrelated to the winter drafts. She knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had survived the slums, that a trap was being laid in the dark. Then, the heavy oak doors of the grand hall groaned and shattered open. A violent gust of snowy wind ripped through the room, extinguishing half the iron chandeliers and plunging the lower tables into shadow. A palace scout stumbled into the center of the hall. His leather armor was heavily torn, and his face was pale, smeared with the undeniable evidence of a brutal, desperate retreat. The sharp, metallic scent of terror instantly overpowered the heavy perfumes of the court. Every wolf in the room shot to their feet, chairs scraping harshly against the stone floor. "Rogue invasion at the western borders, my king," the scout gasped, collapsing to one knee on the polished granite. 3 packs united under a feral alpha. They have breached the outer perimeter. The local garrisons are completely overrun. The temperature in the room plummeted. Kalin rose from his throne, and in that single movement, the gentle, protective husband vanished. He was instantly replaced by the terrifying, ruthless Alpha King of Thornmere. His presence expanded, a suffocating, physical weight that forced the weaker wolves in the room to lower their eyes and expose their throats in involuntary submission. "How many?" he demanded, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates deep beneath the earth. "Thousands, sire," the scout wheezed, clutching his bruised ribs. "They are burning the supply lines. They march for the capital." Chaos erupted in the hall, a cacophony of panicked voices and snarling arguments from the nobility. Kalin did not hesitate. He reached down, his massive hand wrapping securely around Seren's forearm, and pulled her smoothly from her chair. He guided her away from the frantic crowd, pulling her behind a heavy velvet tapestry into a shadowed, secluded stone alcove. The moment the heavy fabric fell closed, shielding them from the court's view, the terrifying beast evaporated. Kalin pressed her back gently against the cold stone wall, his large hands coming up to cup her face. He was trembling. The man who commanded 10,000 lethal warriors was physically shaking as he looked down into her blue eyes. "I have to go," he whispered, the words tearing out of his throat like barbed wire. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, his tempest-colored eyes swirling with an agonizing, desperate guilt. The claiming mark on Seren's collarbone pulsed with a sharp, stabbing pain, a direct mirror of his internal torment. "I have to lead the vanguard. If I do not break their lines by the weekend, they will reach the civilian valleys and slaughter everyone." "I know," Seren murmured, raising her hands to grip his thick wrists. His skin was burning hot against the freezing drafts of the alcove, a stark contrast to the winter storm brewing outside. "I cannot leave you here," Kalin breathed, leaning down to press his forehead against hers in an act of pure, desperate vulnerability. "Not in this den of vipers. Not when they look at you the way they do. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. Leaving you behind feels like I am tearing out my own lungs." "I am the Queen of Thornmere," Seren replied, her voice remarkably steady, projecting a calm she forced into the mate bond to soothe his panicked beast. "I have survived far worse than the sneers of pampered lords and ladies. Go, protect the borders. I will keep the hearth warm until you return." He let out a broken, shuddering breath, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips with a desperate, crushing intensity. The kiss tasted of salt and impending grief. When he finally pulled away, he looked entirely hollowed out, as if leaving her required severing a physical limb. He adjusted the heavy fur cloak over his broad shoulders and stepped back through the tapestry, instantly donning his mask of impenetrable ice. From the shadows near the grand staircase, Silas Vance stepped forward. The captain of the palace garrison was a man of middling height and a remarkably weak chin, his polished silver armor gleaming, despite having never seen a single drop of real combat. He bowed deeply as Kalin approached. "Sire," the corrupted officer said, his voice slick and perfectly subservient, "the royal guard stands ready. We will marshal the outer defences and prepare the cavalry. Take my personal guard. The Iron Guard rides with me to the front, Kalin ordered, his mind already calculating supply lines and brutal battle formations. Captain Vance, you will assume full control of the inner palace security. Double the patrols around the royal chambers. If a single draught of wind touches the Queen, I will personally mount your head on the gates. It shall be done, my king, Silas replied, bowing lower to hide the dark, calculating gleam in his eyes. Seren stepped out from the alcove, her quiet gaze tracking the interaction with a healer's meticulous attention to detail. She watched the subtle, almost imperceptible nod Silas exchanged with Duke Vane, who was standing across the room, idly swirling the last drops of his honeyed wine. A cold, sinking dread settled deep into Seren's stomach, entirely separate from the nausea of her hidden pregnancy. She watched as Silas moved efficiently through the room, giving quiet orders. He was systematically dismissing the battle-hardened veterans who were fiercely loyal to Kalin, replacing them at the palace doors with men wearing the deep crimson armbands of the Vane household. It was done under the flawless guise of military protocol, the best men sent to the front to fight, the reserves held at the rear to guard the castle. But to an observant woman who had spent her life watching the shadows to survive, the reality was glaringly obvious. It was a silent, bloodless coup unfolding right before her eyes, and she was the primary target. Within the hour, the grand courtyard was a flurry of organized violence. Torches hissed and snapped in the freezing blizzard as Kalin mounted his massive black warhorse. The beast pawed at the cobblestones, eager to run into the blinding snow. Seren stood at the top of the grand stairs, wrapped in a thick, rustic wool mantle. Its dense, multi-layered weave had originally been crafted to absorb the soaking, freezing rains of the outer villages, keeping her warm in the harshest conditions. The biting wind whipped her dark hair across her face. Kalin looked back at her one last time, his glowing, molten gold eyes piercing through the heavy snowfall, locking onto her with a fierce, unspoken promise of return. Then he spurred his mount forward. The cavalry roared, a thunderous wave of steel and fur, surging out into the endless white waste, leaving the safety of the fortress behind. The heavy iron portcullis began to lower the moment the last rider cleared the archway. The massive chains ground against the stone, screaming in protest, until the iron spikes slammed into the frozen earth with a concussive boom that rattled the bones of the palace. The gates were sealed shut. The courtyard fell into a sudden, unnatural silence, filled only by the howling of the winter storm raging outside the high walls. Seren did not move from the top of the grand stairs. She stared at the locked gates, the heavy, hollow ache of separation already gnawing at the edges of her soul. The intense heat of the mate bond slowly faded into a dull, distant throb as the physical distance between them grew, leaving her feeling suddenly very cold and incredibly isolated. The castle, which had felt like a sanctuary just hours ago with Kalin at her side, now felt like a massive stone tomb. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head, looking up toward the elevated stone gallery that overlooked the snowy courtyard. Aldous Vane stood there, his hands resting casually on the stone balustrade. The high noble was looking down at her, his pale eyes completely devoid of the mocking civility he had worn during the feast. In the flickering, unsteady torchlight, his smile was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly patient. The Alpha King was gone, and the fragile, collused commoner was finally locked inside the cage. The third day of the Alpha King's absence brought a silence to the capital that pressed heavy as iron against the ancient stone walls of the fortress. Outside the towering, arched windows of the royal suite, a brutal winter blizzard battered against the thick-stained glass. The wind howled like a wounded beast, driving sheets of blinding white snow across the inner courtyards and burying the statues of ancient Lycan heroes in freezing drifts. The bitter draughts seeped beneath the heavy tapestries, carrying the scent of impending frost and deep isolation. The grand royal suite, a cavernous expanse of crimson velvet tapestries and polished obsidian floors, offered absolutely no comfort against the creeping winter chill. Seren sat alone by the massive stone hearth, staring blankly into the flickering orange flames. Her thick wool shawl was pulled tightly over her shoulders, the remarkably dense and highly absorbent fabric acting as her only armor against the creeping cold. The crescent-claiming mark tucked beneath the collar of her gown no longer burned with the fierce, molten heat of her mate's physical proximity. When Kalin was near, the mark felt like a radiant hearth fire, a constant, reassuring hum of protective Lycan energy that kept the shadows at bay. Instead, the magical brand had settled into a dull, rhythmic throb, a hollow, icy ache that perfectly mirrored the vast, snowy leagues stretching between the capital and the western frontiers. She closed her eyes, pressing two collused fingertips against the sensitive skin of her neck, focusing entirely on the faint pulse of his life force out there in the freezing dark. He was alive. He was fighting. He was completely unaware of the domestic war brewing in his own home. That singular, echoing truth anchored her sanity in a palace that was rapidly transforming into a hostile, locked cage. Outside the thick wooden double doors of her chambers, the rhythmic clanking of armored boots served as a constant, grinding reminder of her isolation. Captain Sightless Vance had moved with terrifying efficiency, while the true sovereign was away fighting for their survival. Silas had once sworn a sacred oath to the crown, but his loyalty was as cheap as tarnished copper, easily bought by the highest bidder. Seren could hear the metallic clatter of unfamiliar armor pacing the stone corridors. The heavy steps lacked the synchronized, disciplined precision of Kalin's elite warriors. These were household guards, men loyal only to gold and the deep political coffers of the aristocracy. The shift in power had been entirely bloodless, executed under the flawless guise of military protocol, but the malicious intent was glaringly obvious. The fragile, common-born bride was surrounded, cut off from any outside communication or physical aid. The nobles were tightening the noose, waiting for her to snap. A sharp, perfectly measured knock suddenly shattered the quiet of the room. Before Seren could even issue a verbal command to enter, the heavy iron latch tumbled with a harsh, metallic scrape, and the massive oak doors swung inward. Lady Beatrice glided into the bedchamber, bringing with her a sudden, suffocating wave of heavy gardenia perfume that instantly made the young queen's stomach roll in protest. The noblewoman moved with the fluid, arrogant grace of a predator, certain of its absolute dominance over a cornered prey. Her exquisite gown of silver silk hissed softly against the dark obsidian floor, the heavy fabric catching the firelight and glittering like a cascade of fresh frost. She paused by a massive mahogany bookshelf, trailing a single, perfectly manicured fingernail along the polished wood, openly examining the royal chambers as if she were already measuring the space for her own personal belongings. Behind her, a trembling young maid hurried into the room, carrying a gleaming silver tray, upon which sat a delicate porcelain teapot and two intricately painted cups. "My queen," the duke's daughter murmured, offering a shallow, practiced curtsy that held zero genuine respect. Her pale eyes swept over the commoner's simple wool shawl and unadorned, unbound dark hair, her gaze dripping with a sweet, polished condescension. "You have looked so terribly pale since the king rode away to the borders. The entire court worries endlessly for your remarkably delicate constitution. I thought a moment of quiet companionship might lift your spirits." Seren remained seated by the hearth. She did not rise to meet her arrogant rival. She did not offer a warm, welcoming smile. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. She had spent her entire youth being completely invisible in the dim, muddy corners of healer huts, quietly grinding bitter roots, while powerful, wealthy patrons assumed the servant girl hiding in the shadows was either deaf or dim-witted. They saw the dirt under her fingernails and completely dismissed the sharp, calculating intellect burning behind her bright blue eyes. She understood the intricate, dangerous game of aristocratic observation far better than any noble in the kingdom. Beatrice was not here to offer comfort or sisterly affection. The beautiful, venomous woman was here to inspect the trap, searching for any sign that her poison was taking root. "You are too kind, Lady Beatrice," Seren replied, her voice soft and carefully modulated to sound breathless and physically weak. She allowed her shoulders to slump just a fraction, expertly adopting the exact physical vocabulary of a frightened, overwhelmed prey animal. "The palace is vast, and it feels cold without his presence to warm the halls." The rival's smile widened, a sharp, satisfied curve that did not reach the cold cruelty swirling in her pale eyes. She gestured for the frightened maid to set the heavy silver tray onto the low wooden table between them, dismissing the servant with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Palace life can be overwhelmingly harsh for someone unaccustomed to our ancestral ways," the noblewoman said, her perfectly manicured fingers resting gently against the handle of the steaming porcelain teapot. "And the Alpha King's aura is notoriously crushing." No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. "We are simply astounded by your sheer endurance, though it clearly exacts a heavy, visible physical toll upon your fragile frame." Seren kept her gaze carefully lowered, watching silently as the steaming amber liquid was poured into the delicate, floral-painted cups. The sheer audacity of the insult hung in the warm air, a thinly veiled implication that the commoner was physically breaking down under the immense, unrelenting pressure of the royal mate bond. It was exactly the narrative Duke Vane needed the entire court to swallow. A sickly, entirely unsuitable bride who simply withered away into nothingness when left alone in the vast fortress. "A special chamomile blend," Beatrice continued, offering the fragile saucer with a steady, unblinking stare that challenged the queen to refuse the gift. "Harvested exclusively from the sun-drenched southern valleys. My father requested it from our personal family estates specifically for your recovery. It is highly renowned for calming frayed nerves and inducing a very deep, uninterrupted healing sleep." Seren reached out slowly to accept the cup. She deliberately let her collused, working-class fingers tremble against the delicate porcelain, allowing the small saucer to rattle loudly in the quiet room. The deliberate display of physical weakness caused a flash of dark, undeniable triumph to illuminate the noblewoman's pale face. The rival fully believed she was witnessing the complete psychological and physical collapse of the king's chosen mate. She possessed absolutely no comprehension of the ancient, cosmic bloodline sleeping silently beneath the queen's pale skin, waiting for the precise moment to ignite. "Thank you," the healer whispered, clutching the warm porcelain with both of her hands as if she were desperately seeking basic thermal heat. "Please convey my deepest, most sincere gratitude to the Duke for his extraordinary thoughtfulness." "Oh, he is already well aware of your progress," Beatrice replied smoothly, rising gracefully to her feet. The heavy silver silk of her skirts rustled like dry, dead leaves scraping across a gravestone. She did not bother to pour a cup for herself or pretend to share the warmth. Her singular, deadly objective was complete. "Drink deeply, my queen. Rest your tired eyes and let the world fade away. Sleep is exactly what your body needs right now." The rival turned and glided confidently out of the bedchamber, her sickening gardenia scent lingering in the stifling air like a toxic miasma. The massive timber doors closed with a solid echoing thud. An instant later, the distinct, metallic clack of the exterior deadbolt sliding violently into place echoed through the massive suite, confirming her absolute imprisonment. She was locked inside her own royal chambers. The very second the heavy lock tumbled into place, Seren's entire physical demeanor shifted. The trembling, frightened facade vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness that would have terrified the arrogant noblewoman had she stayed to witness the transformation. Seren set the rattling saucer down onto the wooden table with rock-steady precision. She did not run to the door to fight the heavy iron lock. She did not call out for the corrupted guards who would ignore her desperate pleas. She simply leaned forward, her sharp, intelligent blue eyes fixed intently on the steaming cup of chamomile tea. She raised the delicate porcelain to her face. She did not allow a single, fatal drop to touch her lips. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, fully engaging the highly trained, sensitive olfactory senses of a master apothecary. Beyond the sweet, soothing floral notes of the dried chamomile blossoms, beyond the rich, sticky scent of the wild honey, there it was. Concealed deep within the rising steam was a sharp, unnatural metallic tang that caught in the back of her throat like inhaling fine, crushed glass. The scent was remarkably faint, expertly masked by the heavy perfumes of the court and the rich ingredients of the herbal brew. But to a woman who had spent a decade memorizing the precise chemical signatures of the earth, it was as glaring as a blazing beacon fire in the dead of night. Liquid moon silver. A sudden instinctual chill swept over her skin, entirely unrelated to the freezing drafts bleeding through the castle's stone walls. Seren carefully placed the cup back onto the silver tray, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Liquid moon silver was not merely a simple poison. It was a brutal alchemical weapon crafted from refined lunar ore. It was designed specifically to target and dismantle the robust biological life force of Lycans. For a full-grown, battle-hardened alpha warrior, a continuous daily dose would cause severe lethargy, rapid muscle decay, and eventual catastrophic heart failure. It was the only weapon cowards could wield against true Lycan strength. But for a pregnant female, especially one in the fragile, highly sensitive early stages of carrying a royal heir, the heavy liquid metal was designed to silently, efficiently extinguish the spark of new life. It was expertly formulated to induce a quiet, entirely untraceable loss, leaving the grieving mother physically barren and emotionally ruined, without leaving a single drop of evidence behind. The palace physicians would simply shake their heads, whispering apologies about a fragile commoner body, failing under the heavy demands of a true royal bloodline. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the assassination plot was staggering in its scope. Duke Vane and his fiercely ambitious daughter did not just want to force her off the throne. They were meticulously attempting to erase Kalin's entire genetic legacy before the child could even draw its first breath. They wanted to strip the distant Alpha King of his future, leaving him desperate, broken, and vulnerable to the high nobility's political maneuvering upon his eventual return. A fierce, violently protective warmth flared deep within her lower abdomen. The tiny growing spark of life, a perfect, miraculous biological fusion of her husband's immense, terrifying Lycan strength and her own dormant, godlike Sunborn fire, seemed to pulse in direct defiance to the close proximity of the lethal threat. The maternal instinct within her roared to life, sharp, absolute, and unyielding. She placed her colloosed, scarred hands flat against her stomach, pressing firmly through the thick wool fabric of her shawl. "I will not let them touch you," she whispered fiercely into the empty, echoing room, her voice vibrating with an ancient, resonant authority that belonged exclusively to the lost queens of the sun. "They will burn to ash before a single drop of this poison reaches your blood." To survive this night and expose the depths of their treason, she had to maintain the flawless illusion of her physical vulnerability. The corrupted guards in the hallway, and the spies reporting directly to Duke Vane, were undoubtedly watching through the brass keyhole or listening intently at the barred entryway. If the delicate teacup was discovered entirely full by the morning servants, the conspirators would realize she was aware of their treason. They would immediately abandon the slow, untraceable poison and resort to overwhelming physical violence to secure the throne before Kalin could ever return from the snowy borders. She desperately needed to buy time. She needed to force the arrogant nobles to step fully into the light and proudly confess their crimes, completely unaware of the trap she was setting for them. Seren did not reach for antidotes. She did not risk the fragile life inside her by letting even a microscopic fraction of the toxin cross her lips. Instead, she leaned back heavily in the solid wooden chair, turning her body slightly away from the direct line of sight of the door's keyhole. She reached out with a perfectly steady hand and picked up the delicate porcelain cup of poisoned chamomile. The steam had largely faded into the cold air, leaving the toxic amber liquid tepid and dangerously heavy. She brought the painted rim to her lips, tilting her head back exactly as one would when taking a long, desperate sip of a soothing brew. But her mouth remained tightly shut. With practiced, flawless sleight of hand honed from years of surviving in unforgiving environments, she tipped the edge of the porcelain cup away from her mouth just a fraction of an inch. She allowed the heavy, metallic liquid to pour silently and steadily into the thick, highly absorbent dark wool of her oversized shawl draped across her chest. The dense fabric drank the toxic moisture instantly, hiding the dark stain perfectly within its deep shadows. She let her throat bob, mimicking the swallowing motion perfectly, and let out a soft, shuddering sigh of feigned relief. Not a single drop of the deadly lunar toxin touched her tongue. She lowered the empty cup, deliberately, letting her hand shake just enough to rattle the porcelain against the saucer as she set it back down on the gleaming silver tray. Seren allowed herself to slump heavily against the plush velvet cushions, letting her head loll slightly to the side to paint a flawless, undeniable picture of a rapidly dying queen. Her breathing intentionally became shallow and heavily labored. Her calloused hands fell limply into her lap, her chin dropping to her chest. To anyone watching through the brass keyhole, to anyone listening intently at the chamber's entrance, she was fading exactly like a weak candle running out of wax in the winter wind. Let them think they are winning, she thought fiercely, keeping her eyes closed as the poison safely dried harmlessly in the thick wool of her shawl. Let them grow arrogant in their unearned victory. Let them truly believe the commoner is broken. The crescent mate bond on her collarbone suddenly throbbed with a distant, anxious pulse, her mate's wolf sensing the sudden spike in her adrenaline across the snowy miles. Seren immediately pushed a massive wave of absolute, uncompromising calm back through the ancient connection, wrapping her distant alpha's frantic, roaring heart in a soothing, golden thermal warmth. She was surviving. She was fiercely protecting their future legacy. She was quietly, methodically building a definitive, inescapable ledger of high treason, and when the corrupt court finally locked the grand hall doors to spring their ultimate trap, they would discover exactly what happened when you forced a Sunborn queen into the dark. By the 10th day of the Alpha King's absence, the fortress of Thornmere had been entirely swallowed by the relentless winter storm. The howling blizzard battered the outer battlements, piling massive drifts of snow against the heavy iron portcullis. Inside the ancient stone walls, the biting cold was absolute, seeping through the granite blocks and chilling the very marrow of the remaining inhabitants. The air smelled of damp pine, wood smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of drawn steel. Captain Silas Vance stood at the edge of the elevated courtyard gallery, pulling his thick fur cloak tightly around his weak chin to ward off the freezing drafts. He gazed down at the main gates with a deep, undeniable sense of satisfaction. The transition of power was nearly complete. Over the past week, Silas had methodically dismantled Kalin Ironwood's internal security apparatus. Every seasoned warrior who bore the king's personal crest had been reassigned to meaningless patrols on the outer perimeter or quietly locked in the lower dungeons on fabricated charges of insubordination. In their place, the inner corridors of the palace were now patrolled exclusively by mercenaries and rough household guards wearing the deep crimson armbands of the Vane family. They stood like silent, menacing statues outside the armory, the kitchens, and most importantly, the royal chambers. These were men who cared nothing for honor or the sacred fated mate bonds. They cared only for the heavy pouches of gold promised by the aristocracy. They spat on the polished obsidian floors and laughed in the shadows, confident that the true sovereign was too far away to hear their treason. The trap had been set with flawless, bloodless precision. Footsteps echoed softly against the stone behind him. Silas turned, bowing deeply as Duke Vane emerged from the shadows of the arched colonnade. The high noble was impeccably dressed in a heavy velvet doublet, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the oppressive humidity of the winter storm. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a predator who had already broken the neck of its prey and was simply waiting for the final twitches to cease. He held a crystal goblet of deep red wine, completely unbothered by the freezing temperature of the open gallery. "Report, Captain," Aldous demanded, his voice a smooth, icy murmur that barely rose above the howling wind outside. "The palace is entirely secure, my lord," Silas replied eagerly, desperate for the aristocrat's approval. "The outer gates have been barred with double iron crossbeams. We intercepted the ravens intended for the border camps and burned the letters. No messengers can leave for the western frontiers, and no riders can enter without my explicit command. We control the armory, the granary, and the high towers. The capital belongs to you." The older man did not smile. He simply stared out at the swirling snow, his pale eyes calculating the final variables of his grand equation. "And the commoner. Has my daughter's nightly hospitality yielded the expected results?" "The Queen has not left her chambers in 7 days," the corrupted captain answered, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his features. "The maids who bring her morning trays report that she is completely bedridden. She barely touches her food, and her skin is as pale as the snow outside. She is fading like a starved ember left entirely exposed to the biting frost. Whatever rare herbs your daughter is brewing in that chamomile tea, it has completely shattered the fragile creature." Duke Vane turned his gaze toward the massive stone tower that housed the royal chambers. A dark, absolute triumph burned in his chest. He had spent his entire life mastering the brutal, unforgiving politics of the Lycan aristocracy, carefully building a web of influence and wealth. For generations, the Vane lords had bowed to the ironwood line, forcing down their own ambitions. The sudden arrival of a low-born, collused healer to claim the throne had been a profound, unforgivable insult to his ancient bloodline. But now, the insult was being rectified. He fully believed the toxic liquid moon silver had done its silent, lethal work. In his mind, the secret, unacknowledged royal heir was already dead, extinguished before it could ever pose a threat. And the Queen was nothing but a broken, hollow shell waiting to be discarded so his own daughter could wear the crown. She is weak because she was never meant to survive the crushing weight of true sovereignty, the Duke stated coldly, adjusting the heavy silver signet ring on his right hand. The Alpha King thought he could elevate a simple weed from the mud and call it a rose. Today, we prune the garden. "Shall I send the guards to finish her in her bed?" Silas asked, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his sword. "No," Vane commanded sharply, his eyes flashing with aristocratic disdain. "We are not common thugs butchering sheep in the dark. We are the high nobility of Thornmere. Everything must be done in accordance with the ancient laws. If she dies violently in her bed, Kalin's loyalists in the outer provinces will cry treason and martyr her name. She must be broken publicly. She must sign the abdication with her own hand, confessing her fundamental inadequacy and her treasonous intent to weaken the crown. Only then will her execution be viewed as a necessary, tragic justice." Silas nodded, properly chastised, but still eager for the impending violence. "The loyalist nobles have already been confined to their estates. Only your closest allies remain in the palace. Gather our faction in the main throne room," the Duke ordered, his voice echoing with absolute unquestionable authority. "Lock the main doors, draw the curtains. I want the room sealed tight. Then, go to the royal quarters and drag the little healer out of her bed. Bring her to the dais. It is time for the queen to step down." Silas bowed once more, turning sharply on his heel to execute the final phase of the coup. The Duke stood alone for a moment longer, breathing in the freezing air, his mind completely blind to the reality of the situation. He thought he was walking into a slaughterhouse to dispatch a crippled lamb. He had absolutely no idea he was stepping into a cage with a dormant sun. The immense assembly chamber was a cavernous, oppressive space, its massive vaulted ceilings swallowed by shadows. The towering stained glass windows, usually vibrant with the morning light and depicting ancient Lycan heroes, were choked by the thick grey blizzard pressing against the outside. Iron chandeliers hung low, casting a dim, flickering orange glow that barely pushed back the encroaching darkness. The towering iron-bound doors at the far end of the room had been slammed shut, the massive iron deadbolts sliding into place with a concussive final thud that echoed off the cold granite walls. Seren Vantrell stood at the center of the dais, exactly where she had been presented to the court just 10 days prior. She had not been dragged from her bed when Silas Vance and his armed guards had breached the royal chambers. They had found her fully dressed in a simple, dark woolen gown, sitting quietly by the hearth. She had offered no resistance, walking calmly between the heavily armored mercenaries as they escorted her through the freezing stone corridors. Along the way, she had noticed the missing loyal guards, the locked side doors, and the terrified palace servants hiding trembling in the alcoves. The corrupted soldiers had sneered at her silence, assuming it was the mute terror of a dying woman. They did not notice the absolute steadiness of her breathing or the sharp, calculating gleam in her bright blue eyes. Now she stood alone, completely surrounded by a tightening ring of aristocratic conspirators. The high-born lords and ladies of the Vane faction wore expressions of sneering triumph, their expensive silk garments rustling loudly in the quiet hall. The heavy, suffocating scent of gardenia perfume and ambergris filled the air, mingling with the sharp, aggressive musk of excited wolves. Duke Vane stood at the base of the dais, clutching a thick roll of parchment. Lady Beatrice stood at his right shoulder, a cruel, mocking smile playing on her painted lips as she gazed up at the woman she believed she had successfully poisoned. Behind them, 24 household guards stood with their feet braced apart, their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of their drawn silver blades. The metallic scrape of swords being unsheathed hissed through the room, a clear, undeniable threat of physical violence. Seren did not flinch. She kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her stomach, a subtle, fiercely protective gesture masking the raw maternal power gathering deep within her center. The crescent-claiming mark on her collarbone throbbed with a slow, heavy pulse. Across the vast snow's distance, Kalin's wolf was frantic, sensing the sudden, massive spike in immediate danger. Seren quietly pushed a wave of soothing, honeyed warmth back across the bond, urging her distant mate to stay focused on his battle. She did not need him to save her. She needed him to survive. She would handle the court. She remembered the dim, incense-filled hut of her childhood, the smell of drying herbs, and the raspy voice of her old mentor speaking to a younger, frightened apprentice while Seren quietly ground leaves in the corner. "We are small things in a world of teeth, little Seren. Smallness is a gift. Use it." She had used her perceived smallness perfectly. She had absorbed their insults, deflected their lethal toxins, and allowed them to corner themselves in a locked room where there would be absolutely no witnesses to interrupt her judgment. "It is over, Seren," Duke Vane announced, his voice booming through the cavernous hall. He unrolled the heavy parchment with a sharp snap of his wrists. "Your fragile masquerade has come to its inevitable end. The Alpha King is leagues away, bleeding in the snow for a kingdom you are entirely unfit to rule." You have brought nothing but weakness and shame to the High Court of Thornmere. Have I, my lord? Seren asked, her voice soft, melodic, and completely devoid of fear. The sheer calmness of her tone caused a ripple of unease to pass through the front row of the nobility. They had expected her to weep, to beg for mercy, to collapse under the crushing weight of their combined authority. "Do not play the fool," Lady Beatrice spat, stepping forward, her silver silk gown flashing in the dim torchlight. She sneered at the Queen's simple attire, her gaze dripping with disgust. "Behold yourself, standing there in peasant rags. You are pale, trembling, decaying from the inside out. The immense pressure of the Lycan mate bond has broken your fragile human constitution, just as we predicted. You are barren, weak, and entirely defective." Seren gazed down at the beautiful, venomous rival. She thought of the dense, multi-layered weave of her rustic woolen shawl hidden in her chambers, its high absorbency perfectly trapping 7 days' worth of toxic liquid moon silver. She thought of the bitter moonflower root she had secretly ground to neutralize the heavy poison, and the tiny, robust spark of life currently safely curled inside her womb, completely untouched by their malice. They saw only what they wanted to see, a victim. They were blinded by their own arrogance. "I am standing before you," the Queen replied simply, her sharp blue eyes locking onto the older man's pale gaze. "I am breathing. I am sovereign here. You are a peasant wearing a stolen crown." Aldous snarled, losing a fraction of his aristocratic composure. He stepped up onto the first tier of the dais, brandishing the parchment like a weapon. "This is a formal confession of treason. It details your gross negligence, your attempt to undermine the security of the fortress, and your willing abdication of the throne in favor of the ancient bloodlines. Sign it, and we will grant you a swift, merciful end. Refuse, and my men will demonstrate exactly how the old packs dealt with defective Omegas." The armed guards stepped closer, the circle tightening. The sharp, jagged edges of their silver blades caught the flickering orange light of the chandeliers. Silas Vance stood among them, his weak chin jutting forward in an attempt to appear intimidating as he gripped his broadsword. Seren slowly reached up and pushed the sleeve of her dark woolen gown back, exposing her left forearm to the freezing draughts of the hall. The pale skin soon was unblemished, except for a faint, circular scar near her wrist, a perfectly smooth, hollow indentation that appeared as a faded burn. It was the ancient seal placed upon her by the elders of her extinct covenant, designed to keep her godlike magic entirely suppressed. Duke Vane let out a harsh, barking laugh, pointing his thick finger at her exposed wrist. "Witness her. She even carries the brand of a broken wolf. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. You are a completely empty vessel, trying to hold an ocean. You are nothing." Seren traced the edge of the invisible scar with her right thumb. The stinging humiliation they sought to inflict simply evaporated, replaced by a profound, terrifying clarity. They were entirely wrong. The mark was not an absence. It was a dam holding back a cosmic flood. For years, she had lived in the shadows, grinding bitter roots, hiding her true nature to survive in a world ruled by teeth and claws. She had swallowed her pride, endured their insults, and played the silent, fragile healer because she had promised her ancestors she would remain hidden. She had wanted a simple life. She had wanted to be just a wife, a mother, a quiet presence in a loud world. But they had crossed the line. They had tried to poison her unborn child. They had locked the doors, drawn their silver blades, and threatened the future legacy of the Alpha King. The time for hiding was over. "You are right about one thing, Duke Vane," Seren whispered. Her voice did not echo loudly through the hall, but it carried a strange, resonant frequency that caused the heavy stone pillars to vibrate subtly. The armed guards frowned, glancing nervously at the floor as a low, humming vibration began to build in the air. "I have carried a void," she continued, her fingers pressing firmly against the hollow mark. "But you do not understand what it was holding back. Deep Deep within her chest, the ancient Sunborn covenant awoke. It did not stir slowly. It ignited with the violent, explosive force of a dying star. The void in her wrist cracked open like a physical fault line, shattering the invisible seal that had bound her for decades. A profound, staggering relief crashed through her as the crushing weight of her lifelong invisibility finally evaporated. For the first time in her existence, she was no longer shrinking to fit into their narrow, hostile world. She was expanding, breathing deeply as her suppressed soul stretched its golden wings. The dull, icy ache of the mate bond on her collarbone was instantly incinerated, replaced by a roaring, blinding heat that surged through her veins like liquid gold. The heavy, oppressive winter chill of the royal pavilion vanished in a single heartbeat, instantly replaced by a searing, suffocating thermal pressure. The ambient temperature spiked so drastically that the breath of the mercenaries no longer plumed in the freezing air. Instead, sweat instantly beaded on their foreheads, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear replaced the musk of their predatory excitement. The massive stained glass windows depicting the moon goddess rattled violently in their stone frames as the atmospheric pressure inside the locked room expanded. The air around Seren began to distort, rippling with an intense, suffocating heat haze. The dim, flickering flames of the iron chandeliers were suddenly violently extinguished, starved of oxygen, but the cavernous room did not fall into darkness. Instead, a brilliant, terrifying golden light began to leak from the pores of her skin. The hollow scar on her left wrist completely dissolved, replaced by a blazing, radiant ring of pure solar fire that illuminated the terrified faces of the aristocratic conspirators. Lady Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward as the overwhelming, divine glow washed over her, making her expensive silver silk gown appear suddenly cheap, grey, and entirely insignificant. "Seize her!" Aldous screamed, absolute panic finally shattering his arrogant facade as he stumbled clumsily backward down the steps of the dais, throwing his arms up to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. "Cut her down! Now!" Silas Vance lunged forward with a desperate, guttural shout, raising his heavy silver broadsword high above his head to strike the queen. The metal of his blade was already heating up, growing uncomfortably warm in his leather-gloved hands. But the corrupted captain was too driven by adrenaline and terror to stop his momentum. He never made it past the first step. Seren raised her chin, and when she opened her eyes, the soft, observant blue was entirely gone. Her irises were burning with molten, radiant gold, glowing with a divine, terrifying authority that had not been seen in the world for 1,000 years. The raw, elemental energy bleeding from her frame began to coalesce into solid solar chains of pure, blinding light, hovering like deadly, coiled serpents in the superheated air around her. She did not raise a weapon. She did not scream. She simply stopped, holding back the light. The immense atmospheric pressure of her expanding Sunborn magic finally reached its breaking point. With a deafening, thunderous crack, the towering stained glass windows lining the grand chamber completely shattered outward. A torrential shower of colorful, jagged glass shards exploded into the freezing blizzard, the concussive force violently shaking the granite foundations of Thornmere Palace. The sudden rush of freezing winter wind was instantly vaporized by the blistering solar heat radiating from the queen. Without a single word of command, the solid solar chains snapped forward with blinding, inescapable speed. They lashed out across the stone floor, striking with the precision of ancient vipers. One burning chain whipped tightly around Silas Vance's chest, instantly melting his armor and throwing him violently backward to the floor, his sword clattering uselessly away. In the same breath, a dozen more chains surged toward the scrambling aristocrats. They coiled mercilessly around Duke Vane and Lady Beatrice, tearing them down from their arrogant postures and slamming them onto the cold granite. The remaining conspirators shrieked as the golden light wrapped around their limbs, completely immobilizing the armed guards and the treacherous nobility alike. They were utterly pinned, weeping and gasping for breath beneath the suffocating weight of the very queen they had thought was weak. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound in the ruined hall was the gentle hiss of vaporized snow settling against the superheated granite. The sharp, electric tang of ozone hung thick in the air, a visceral reminder of the raw cosmic power that had just been unleashed. The golden chains thrummed with a terrifying, resonant frequency. They emitted a continuous, vibrating hum that sounded like a massive crystal bell being struck deep beneath the earth. Silas Vance whimpered in agony, his face pressed painfully against the cold granite floor. The polished silver armor that had been his greatest pride was now a superheated, suffocating cage. The solid solar light binding his chest did not burn his flesh, but it radiated an immense, inescapable thermal pressure that made drawing a full breath entirely impossible. He tried to squirm, his weak chin scraping against the unforgiving stone, but the magical gravity only increased. It pressed him down with the absolute, crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. Seren did not step toward the corrupted captain immediately. She merely stood at the center of the dais, her unblemished hands resting gently over her lower abdomen in a fiercely protective gesture. The intense, divine glow bleeding from her pores illuminated the cavernous throne room, entirely banishing the encroaching winter shadows that had plagued the room. The shattered remnants of the towering stained glass windows lay scattered across the obsidian floor like glittering, jagged jewels. Outside the ruined stone frames, the brutal blizzard continued to howl relentlessly, driving sheets of blinding white snow toward the interior of the palace. Yet, the instant the freezing flakes crossed the threshold of the room, they met the invisible, blistering wall of her Sunborn aura and vaporized into nothingness. The ambient temperature within the hall had stabilized into a deep, oppressive summer heat. It smelled sharply of atmospheric ozone, baked granite, and the ancient, undeniable power of the cosmos. A few yards away, Lady Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The beautiful, ambitious rival, who had only hours ago sneered at the Queen's simple wool garments, was now completely stripped of her arrogant grace. She thrashed wildly against the floor, her expensive silver silk gown tearing loudly as she desperately tried to drag herself backward toward the locked exit. A targeted tendril of molten golden fire snapped forward with the lethal precision of a striking viper. It wrapped securely around her delicate wrist, instantly halting her frantic retreat. The sudden, violent friction of the solar chain singed the meticulously styled ends of her pale hair, sending the acrid stench of burnt keratin into the suffocating air. Beatrice screamed in genuine, unadulterated terror. Her wide eyes reflected the terrifying reality that she was no longer the apex predator of this court. She was nothing but an insect pinned beneath a magnifying glass, entirely at the mercy of the burning sun. Duke Vane lay paralyzed near the base of the steps, his chest heaving with extremely shallow, panicked gasps. The thick roll of parchment, the fabricated confession of treason he had intended to force Seren to sign, had fluttered out of his grasp. It was currently crumbling into fine, grey ash under the sheer ambient heat radiating from the dais. He strained his neck, his pale eyes wide with an alien, incomprehensible horror as he looked up at the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. The delicate, common-born healer with corloosed hands was completely gone. In her place stood a sovereign of terrifying, biblical magnitude. Her irises were swimming with liquid gold, projecting a silent, crushing authority that made the ancient Lycan blood in his veins completely freeze. Seren slowly descended the steps of the dais. Her movements were fluid, completely silent, and unhurried. The heavy, dark wool of her simple dress did not catch fire, but it seemed to actively absorb the divine light, making her figure appear almost ethereal against the backdrop of the ruined hall. She did not draw a silver blade to threaten her captives. She did not shout or raise her voice to assert her sudden dominance. Her quiet resilience had been the seed of this undeniable power, and she wielded her silence now as a far more devastating weapon than any broadsword. She stopped inches from the Duke's trembling face. The high noble, who had spent decades mastering the brutal, unforgiving politics of the aristocratic hierarchy, could not even muster the strength to turn his head away from her blinding gaze. "You believed your insidious little game was succeeding," Seren whispered. Her voice did not echo loudly, but it carried a strange dual resonance, layered with the haunting echoes of 1,000 lost queens of her extinct covenant. The sound vibrated directly in the teeth and bones of the pinned conspirators. "You thought was quietly wilting in the dark. You assumed the crushing pressure of the Lycan mate bond was dismantling my fragile human constitution, exactly as you had so confidently predicted to your followers." Aldustus swallowed hard, a thick drop of terrified sweat rolling down his temple to pool on the granite floor. He desperately tried to speak, to offer a silver-tongued defense to save his own life, but the heavy solar chain wrapped across his throat constricted. It tightened just enough to reduce his arrogant words to a pathetic, gurgling wheeze. "I smelled the liquid moon silver the very first night your daughter brought the chamomile tea into my chambers," Seren continued, her tone perfectly even, devoid of anger but overflowing with absolute, terrifying certainty. The metallic taint was expertly masked by wild honey and the cloying scent of sweet gardenia, but you forgot one crucial detail. I am an apothecary. I have spent my entire life memorizing the exact chemical signatures of the Earth. Did you honestly believe a lethal lunar toxin could be slipped past a woman who knows the scent of a poisonous root from 100 paces away? Beatrice sobbed uncontrollably from her pinned position on the floor, the realization of her complete failure crashing down upon her shoulders. "I never swallowed a single drop of your poison," the Queen revealed, her golden eyes locking onto the older man's terrified gaze. "Every evening, I tipped the steaming porcelain cup against the highly absorbent dark wool of my shawl. I sat in that freezing room, pretending to fade, pretending to collapse under your brilliant assassination plot, simply to give you the confidence to expose yourselves." Duke Vane didn't know that the woman standing on the dais possessed a magic that had buried in entire armies who dared to challenge the sun. You thought you were walking into a slaughterhouse to dispatch a crippled lamb. You had absolutely no idea you were stepping directly into the jaws of a god. The absolute humiliation of the revelation shattered the last remaining fragments of the noble's aristocratic pride. He had been outplayed, outsmarted, and completely outmaneuvered from the very first day by a woman he considered no better than dirt beneath his boots. He closed his eyes, a broken, defeated whimper escaping his lips as the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation settled heavily into his chest. They had intentionally locked the room's massive portals to ensure she had absolutely no escape from their blades. Thank you for locking the doors, because being sealed in the dark had allowed her to finally stop hiding, to claim a sovereign destiny, a powerful life, and she would never, ever look back. You demanded a formal abdication, Seren said, stepping gracefully over the aristocrat's paralyzed form to address the entire room of weeping, trapped rebels. You wished to strip me of my title, in accordance with the ancient laws of Thornmere. Very well. Let us strictly observe the ancient laws you hold so dear. She raised her right hand, her fingers gracefully weaving through the superheated air. The solid solar chains, binding the conspirators, instantly flared with a blinding white-hot intensity. The magic did not scorch their living flesh, but it aggressively targeted the physical symbols of their unearned authority. The intricate, silver-embroidered Vane family crests on the Duke's velvet doublet and Lady Beatrice's torn silk gown began to smoke violently. Within seconds, the ancient heraldry caught fire, burning away entirely. It left nothing but charred, empty holes over their hearts. The aristocratic emblems they had wielded as shields of superiority were systematically erased from existence by a force far older and purer than any wolf pack's lineage. Aldous of the House of Vane, Seren decreed, her resonant voice filling every corner of the vast hall. For the crime of high treason, for the attempted assassination of the crown, and for seeking to poison an unborn royal heir, I strip you of your lands, your titles, and your voice in this court. You are no longer a lord of this kingdom. You are nothing but a traitor bound to the stone. The older man let out a ragged, agonizing sob as the magical decree settled over his mind, sealing his complete social and political ruin. Seren turned her glowing, molten gaze towards Silas Vance and the terrified household guards. The mercenaries, who had eagerly accepted heavy pouches of gold to betray their true sovereign, were currently trembling so violently their armor rattled aggressively against the granite. "And you, Captain," the Queen said, her tone dripping with a quiet, devastating disappointment that cut deeper than any physical blade. "You sold your honor, your sworn oaths, and the safety of your king for a handful of silver coins. You abandoned the protective duty of a Lycan warrior to become a coward lurking in the shadows." She flicked her fingers downward. The solar gravity around the mercenaries shifted with a sickening lurch. The heavy leather pouches tied to their belts, filled with the blood money they had been paid by the aristocracy, suddenly superheated to an extreme degree. The silver coins inside melted rapidly into useless, glowing slag. The molten metal burned through the leather bindings and dropped onto the obsidian floor with a loud hiss of vaporized moisture. The guards cried out in shock, though the heat miraculously stopped, just short of blistering their skin. Their weapons, the sharp silver broadswords they had drawn to threaten a pregnant woman, were violently warped and bent by the magical pressure, rendering them permanently useless for combat. "You will all remain exactly where you are," Seren commanded, her maternal instinct completely satisfied by the absolute neutralization of the immediate threat. "The light will not let you starve, but it will not let you rest. You will lie here in the ruins of your own arrogance, reflecting upon your treason until the Alpha King returns to this capital to deliver his final, physical judgment upon your lives." While the absolute silence of defeat settled over the trapped conspirators in the ruined hall, the physical ramifications of Seren's massive magical deployment were already echoing across the vast, snowy continent. The crescent claiming mark on her collarbone, which had been a dull icy ache for 10 agonizing days, was now a blazing conduit of pure cosmic energy. It throbbed with a relentless, euphoric rhythm, pumping the golden warmth of her awakened Sunborn covenant directly across the mystical tether of the fated mate bond. She could physically feel the sudden, jarring shock reverberating from the very other side of the invisible connection. Hundreds of miles away, on the brutal, blood-soaked western frontiers, the blizzard raged with unforgiving violence. Kalin Ironwood stood knee-deep in a frozen, crimson-stained snowdrift. His massive chest he heaved with exhaustion as he swung his heavy broadsword through the thick neck of a massive rogue alpha. The battle had been a grueling, relentless nightmare of teeth and steel, demanding every ounce of his savage Lycan strength to protect the civilian valleys. He was covered in freezing gore, his steely gaze narrowed aggressively against the biting wind, his mind a chaotic blur of tactical commands and severe physical fatigue. Suddenly, the world around him simply stopped moving. The claiming mark branded over his pounding heart did not just flare, it detonated. An impossible, volcanic heat exploded in the absolute center of his chest, completely overriding the freezing bite of the winter storm. Kalin dropped his heavy broadsword into the snow, his massive hands flying to his chest as he fell hard to his knees in the middle of the active battlefield. It was not a sensation of pain that brought the giant warrior down. It was a massive, overwhelming tsunami of pure, concentrated maternal fury, divine sovereignty, and absolute, undeniable safety. The Alpha King gasped heavily. his breath tearing through his lungs as the golden thermal warmth flooded his veins, thawing the deep exhaustion from his muscles in a single heartbeat. The connection to his mate, which had been fraught with distant anxiety and terrifying vulnerability since the moment he rode away, was suddenly radiating an aura of supreme, invincible power. He closed his eyes tightly, completely ignoring the snarling rogue wolves circling the outer perimeter of his vision. Through the blinding light of the bond, he could feel her soul. He could feel the absolute stillness of her breathing, the steady, robust pulse of their hidden unborn child, and the crushing, gravity-like pressure she had just unleashed upon their enemies. She had not just survived the Viper's Nest in the capital, she had completely consumed it in holy fire. The feral rogues closest to the kneeling king suddenly stopped their aggressive advance, their ears pinning back sharply against their skulls. They whined pitifully, taking nervous, stumbling steps backward in the snow. The scent rolling off Kalin ironwood was no longer just the metallic tang of blood and winter ice. It was the sharp, terrifying scent of atmospheric ozone and blistering summer heat, a direct olfactory reflection of his mate's awakened cosmic lineage filtering through their bonded souls. Kalin opened his eyes. The familiar storm-grey irises had shifted entirely, burning fiercely with an answering ring of molten gold. The deep, agonizing fear that had haunted his every step since leaving the fortress evaporated instantly. It was replaced by an earth-shattering surge of pride and violently possessive urgency. They were wrong, because the Alpha King had finally felt the absolute truth roaring across the bond, and he was riding hard for what was his. He surged powerfully to his feet, ignoring the retreating rogues entirely, and turned his massive frame toward his bewildered field commanders. "Break their lines and finish the slaughter," Kalin roared, his voice carrying the thunderous, undeniable weight of an approaching avalanche. "Secure the perimeter. I am returning to Thornmere immediately. The Queen has secured the capital." Back in the ruined hall, the violent crescendo of the political coup settled gently into an eerie, eternal stillness. For 2 full days, the relentless blizzard outside continued to batter the fortress walls without mercy, but the interior of the throne room remained a pocket of impossible, radiant summer. Seren did not leave the hall. She moved with quiet, measured grace, pulling a simple wooden chair from one of the overturned banquet tables and placing it deliberately in the center of the dais. She actively refused to sit on the grandiose iron throne, choosing to reign from a place of humble, unyielding strength. The golden chains binding the conspirators maintained their suffocating pressure without faltering for a single second, feeding endlessly on the vast, cosmic reserves of her awakened bloodline. Duke Vane and Lady Beatrice were quickly reduced to weeping, broken shells. Their eyes were constantly watering from the brilliant, unyielding glare of the magic pinning them to the floor. They could not sleep. They could barely turn their heads to look at one another. They simply lay on the cold stone, suffering the agonizing, physical weight of their absolute failure. Slowly, tentatively, the terrified loyal servants, who had been locked in the lower kitchens by the corrupted guards, began to creep out of the deep shadows. They peeked carefully through the shattered archways, gasping in pure, unadulterated awe at the sight of the glowing, peaceful queen sitting calmly amidst the terrified, pinned nobility. Seren offered them a soft, reassuring smile, her golden eyes warm and exceptionally gentle to those who meant no harm. She graciously accepted a fresh cup of pure, untainted tea from a weeping, deeply grateful maid, holding the warm porcelain protectively against her stomachs as she stared out at the vaporizing snow. The massive, hostile world of teeth and claws had tried its hardest to crush her, but she had simply refused to break. Now bathed in the eternal light of her ancestors, she was just waiting for her mate to finally come home. The relentless thunder of heavy iron horseshoes echoing across the frozen earth masked the howling winter blizzard. Kalin Ironwood rode with the terrifying ferocity of a starving predator tracking a blood scent. The rogue wolf invasion had been completely slaughtered, but the hard-fought victory brought absolutely no relief to the exhausted sovereign. Every soldier in the cavalry pushed their massive war horses to the absolute brink, never pausing to bind their bleeding wounds or wipe the freezing gore from their silver armor. The Alpha King was completely consumed by the blazing tether of the fated mate bond anchored deep within his chest. For 10 agonizing days, the crescent mark over his heart had been a dull void of icy anxiety. Since 2 days ago, it had become a roaring conduit of pure cosmic fire. The intense golden warmth acted as a physical compass, dragging him back toward the capital. He could feel the residual echoes of Seren's massive magical deployment humming against his ribs, tasting sharply of atmospheric ozone and baked granite. He knew, with the terrifying clarity of a desperate mate, that the rogue attack had been a perfectly timed distraction. Kalin gripped the thick leather reins so tightly the heavy seams began to split. He remembered the cold smirk on Duke Vane's aristocratic face and the slick tone of Silas Vance as the corrupted captain assumed control of inner palace security. The realization of his own blind arrogance hit the giant warrior harder than any physical blow. He had ridden away to protect people, leaving his fragile healer locked inside a stone cage surrounded by vipers. Lady Beatrice had confidently whispered that the common-born bride would break under the crushing isolation. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. The jagged spires of Thornmere Palace materialized through the dense falling snow. A localized atmospheric anomaly had settled over the central keep. The violent blizzard still raged against the outer battlements, but the heavy snowdrifts actively melted the moment they touched the interior courtyard walls. Thick clouds of white steam hissed into the freezing air, rolling off the superheated granite blocks. The sky directly above the Grand Hall was completely clear, revealing a massive pillar of shimmering heat haze. Kalin did not wait for the heavy portcullis to be formally raised. He spurred his exhausted war-horse directly toward the barred gates, vaulting from the saddle at the last second. His armored boots hit the cobblestones with a concussive crunch. He lunged at the iron crossbeams, channeling the raw fury of his Lycan strength, and violently tore the locking mechanisms straight out of the ancient stone. The heavy oak gates shattered inward with a deafening crash. The corrupted mercenaries, wearing the crimson armbands of the Vane family, scrambled backward in pure terror. They had been paid heavy pouches of silver, but the sight of the blood-soaked, enraged sovereign completely broke their treacherous resolve. Kalin did not even draw his heavy broadsword. His stormy irises burned with a terrifying ring of molten gold, projecting a suffocating aura of absolute dominance that forced the cowardly guards to fall to their knees in the muddy slush. He ignored them entirely, marching relentlessly toward the inner corridors. The stone hallways leading to the royal wing were eerily silent. There was no chaotic clamor of a political coup or the agonizing screams of dying loyalists. Instead, the air grew increasingly heavy and impossibly warm. The biting winter drafts were entirely gone, replaced by a thick, oppressive summer heat that made the freezing gore on his armor begin to melt and drip onto the polished obsidian floors. The heavy velvet tapestries hung perfectly still. Kalin rounded the final corner, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The massive oak doors of the primary audience hall were severely warped, the dark varnish actively bubbling from the intense thermal pressure radiating from the other side. A dozen elite mercenaries lay unconscious in the corridor, their polished silver armor bent and partially melted by a force they could not comprehend. The feral warrior threw his massive shoulder against the heavy wood, bursting into the throne room, completely prepared to slaughter every single aristocrat who dared threaten his family. The sheer sensory impact of the ruined hall stopped the Alpha King dead in his tracks. There was no scent of spilled blood or the metallic tang of dark poison. The cavernous rooms smelled exclusively of sweet chamomile, fresh rain, and the blinding, terrifying power of the cosmos. The towering stained glass windows were entirely gone, shattered outward into a million glittering fragments buried in the melting snow outside. The violent blizzard actively tried to breach the open stone archways, but the freezing wind was instantly vaporized by an invisible blistering wall of pure thermal energy. Scattered across the floor of the dais, the arrogant architects of the treasonous coup were completely broken. The solid solar chains of pure, raw light hummed with a terrifying scriptal resonance as they pinned the high nobility to the unforgiving granite. Duke Vane lay paralyzed near the bottom step, his expensive velvet doublet scorched and entirely devoid of the ancient silver crest. The older man was weeping silently, his pale eyes completely hollowed out by absolute failure. A few yards away, Lady Beatrice was curled into a trembling ball, her beautiful silk gown torn to shreds, the tips of her pale hair singed by the lethal golden fire wrapping her wrists. Silas Vance was pressed face down, gasping for shallow breaths beneath the crushing weight of the magical light. And sitting peacefully in the exact center of the ruined dais, completely untouched by the devastation, was the Queen. Seren Vantrell remained in the simple wooden chair she had claimed, the dark fabric of her gown actively absorbing the ambient, divine glow bleeding into the room. She was holding a fresh, steaming porcelain cup of untainted tea with both colloosed hands, resting it gently against the subtle curve of her lower abdomen in a gesture of absolute maternal protection. When the heavy doors crashed open, she looked up. Her sharp blue eyes no longer glowed with the terrifying molten gold of her awakened covenant, but they remained incredibly bright, carrying the serene, unshakable weight of a woman who had finally claimed her sovereignty. The heavy silver broadsword slipped from Kalin's gloved hand, clattering loudly against the polished obsidian floor. The sharp metallic sound broke the eerie silence, causing the pinned aristocrats to flinch in renewed terror, but the Alpha King did not even glance at the weeping traitors. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his armored boots leaving tracks of melted snow and freezing mud across the immaculate stone. His breathing was ragged, his massive chest heaving as the ferocious beast inside him completely unraveled at the sight of her perfect safety. He reached the base of the steps. He did not march up to demand a report or assert his traditional Lycan authority. Instead, the most feared, ruthless warrior in the three realms simply stopped, his massive frame trembling visibly. Slowly, deliberately, Kalin Ironwood fell to his knees on the cold granite. The heavy iron plates of his leg armor scraped harshly against the stone as he bowed his head, completely surrendering his imposing physical dominance. He pressed his freezing hands flat against the floor, his broad shoulders shaking with the sheer agonizing relief that threatened to tear his heart completely in half. The terrified surviving court watched the apex predator fall to his knees, utterly bewildered by the profound display of absolute submission. They had spent their entire lives believing he was a ruthless, unfeeling monster. But Seren knew the quiet, undeniable truth hidden beneath his hardened exterior. Because monsters do not kneel in the ruins of their own throne room to surrender. Because monsters do not weep for those they left behind. Because monsters did not look at her the way he did. She set her delicate porcelain teacup onto the silver tray with a soft, deliberate clink. Seren stood up from the wooden chair. She walked slowly down the steps, the heavy woolen skirts of her gown brushing softly against the stone. She stopped directly in front of the kneeling giant, reaching out with her corloosed healer's hands to gently cup his cold, blood-splattered cheeks. Kalin let out a broken, shuddering breath that sounded incredibly close to a sob. He leaned heavily into her warm palms, pressing a desperate, lingering kiss against the faint, circular scar on her left wrist, the exact place where the hollow mark containing her ancient magic had finally shattered. "I left you," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse. "I left you alone in the dark with these treacherous bastards. I should have known. I should have burned this entire court to the ground the moment they dared to mock your hands." "You left to protect the innocent," Seren replied, her voice soft, melodic, and completely devoid of any lingering fear. She stepped closer, gently guiding his massive, trembling hands up from the cold floor and placing them firmly against the thick wool covering her lower abdomen. "And I stayed to protect ours. You do not need to burn the court. My king, I have already handled the pruning." Kalin closed his eyes as the vibrant spark of life pulsing beneath her skin met the freezing pads of his fingers. The tiny fusion of his Lycan strength and her blinding Sunborn fire was entirely untouched by the venomous plots of the aristocracy. A soul-deep shudder wrecked his massive frame. He wrapped his thick arms securely around her waist, burying his face into the soft fabric of her dress. He wept silently in the ruins of his own throne room, utterly unashamed of his raw vulnerability, anchored by the quiet, unbreakable resilience of his chosen mate. After a long, quiet moment of profound emotional restoration, Kalin slowly lifted his head. The tears clinging to his dark lashes did not diminish the terrifyingly cold fury that reignited in his storm-grey eyes as he finally turned his attention to the weeping conspirators. The ferocious ruler had returned. "My queen," the king said, his voice dropping into a lethal, resonant register that made the heavy stone pillars vibrate. "What is your final judgment upon this filth?" "The vain crest has been completely burned from their chests," she answered, her tone calm and flawlessly analytical. "They have been stripped of their lands, their wealth, and their voices in this high court. Their swords are broken. They possess absolutely nothing left to offer the world. Then they shall serve as a permanent testament to the absolute sovereignty of the crown," Kalin decreed. Guards, a dozen battle-hardened veterans of the royal garrison, marched swiftly into the ruined hall, completely ignoring the blistering heat of the solar chains as they awaited their sovereign's command. "Drag these traitors down to the deepest levels of the obsidian dungeons," the king ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, merciless finality. "Seal the iron doors and throw the keys into the freezing river. They will never see the light of the sun again. And if a single nobleman dares to whisper a word of sympathy, you will burn their ancestral estates to ash and salt the earth." The loyal soldiers moved with brutal efficiency, hauling the sobbing aristocrats up from the granite floor and dragging them mercilessly out. Lady Beatrice's hysterical screams grew fainter until the heavy iron doors of the lower levels slammed shut. The corrupted court of Thornmere had been completely, systematically dismantled. The brutal, relentless winter eventually broke, giving way to a remarkably vibrant, sun-drenched spring. The thawing of the northern territories, the elders would recount in hushed tones for generations to come, was not merely brought by the changing of seasons. It was fundamentally brought by a queen who possessed the blinding fire of the cosmos, and who had quietly taught a terrifying frozen beast exactly how to love. The ancestral solar court was beautifully restored. The massive stained glass windows were entirely rebuilt, illustrating the warm, radiant golden light of the Sunborn covenant, intertwining perfectly with the silver crescent of the moon. The oppressive shadows were permanently banished, replaced by a constant, gentle warmth nurturing the sprawling botanical gardens. Seren sat peacefully on a carved wooden bench beneath the blooming branches of a massive white willow tree. The air smelled of sweet jasmine and the comforting musk of her protective mate. She gently rocked a small, tightly swaddled bundle in her arms. Their newborn son had been born with a thick shock of dark hair and eyes that shifted miraculously between storm grey and molten, glowing gold. He was perfect. He was entirely safe. Kalin stepped quietly onto the garden path, stripped of his heavy silver armor. Wearing a simple linen shirt, he sat down heavily on the bench beside her, pulling her gently against his warm side. He watched in absolute awe as the tiny infant reached up with a clumsy, chubby fist to grasp his collar. Seren leaned her head against his broad shoulder, her calloused thumb gently stroking the soft, warm cheek of their child. She remembered the dark, incense-filled hut of her childhood, the bitter scent of crushed roots, and the terrifying, brutal world she had been forced to navigate in absolute silence. She smiled, pressing a tender kiss to the baby's forehead. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my sweet child," Seren whispered into the quiet, sunlit garden, her voice filled with ancient, undeniable wisdom. "Smallness is a gift, use it." The Alpha King chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of pure contentment that vibrated gently against her side. "You were never small, my love," he murmured, his silver-grey gaze bright with unshed, joyful tears. "You were just waiting for the world to be quiet enough to hear you." The silent, invisible healer had crashed into a frozen, hostile kingdom expecting to survive a life of quiet endurance. Instead, she had completely rewritten the destiny of an entire empire. Because finding true worth was never about being the loudest voice in the room. She had found the partner who made her want to build a better world, a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back.